welcome to all of you for joining us today to discuss India at the crossroads of legacy and democracy. This is an especially timely topic to discuss at this moment, when India's self-description as one of the fastest growing economies in the world clashes not only with the burden of a past that includes colonialism, but also with differing perceptions of India's democratic commitments within and outside the country. Our three distinguished panelists will explore the issues surrounding democratic governance through the lenses of caste inequality, domestic politics and foreign policy impact, and the role of institutions, including the Indian Parliament. The subtitle of this panel, At the Crossroads of Legacy and Democracy, suggests that the latter term may be more aspirational than the former, which is not a bad thing in itself. The attempt to forge democratic principles out of obstinate legacies that include caste and gender inequalities, sectarian rivalries, extremes of wealth and poverty, and unequal educational access is part of the story that underwrites India's post-colonial trajectory. The secular experiment anchoring India's sense of itself as a democratic, pluralistic nation has experienced enormous tension in the years since Indian independence from British rule. At times, the tension is outwardly visible through the violent conflicts that engulf religious and caste communities from time to time. But at other times, the violence might be described as slow violence, so incremental that its effect is visible only in the longue durée. Whether through the name changes of towns and streets or a rewriting of history in school curricula, the national identity being shaped or reshaped begs the question of whether it encompasses the entirety of India's population. Whose history has primacy and whose history is eclipsed? A mark of a vibrant democracy is the proliferation of voices that argue, debate, question, challenge, probe, reflect, and learn. What Amartya Sen called the argumentative Indian is as good a definition of Indian democracy as any that I have seen. Yet that tradition of heterodox thought and dissent is under siege even as we speak. The low threshold for India's tolerance of criticisms, especially those emanating from the West, is one of the issues I hope we will discuss today. There is a raging debate going on whether such criticisms constitute an offense to India's national integrity. The fact that we are having this discussion today on the stage of the Asia Society gives us an opportunity to reflect on the discourse of democracy as an act of intellectual engagement. Now, as for today's panel, each speaker will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and after all three have spoken, we will have a panel discussion for about 20 minutes. There will then be a Q&A for about 15 minutes at the end, after which Rory will come up just to say a few words about the exhibition tour of comparative health. So the order of presentations is that we will first have to my left Aparna Pande, who is Director Initiative on the Future of India and South Asia at Hudson Institute, followed by Ronojoy Sen, who is Senior Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies and the South Asian Studies Program of the National Institute of Singapore. And then finally, our last speaker, Kanchan Chandra, who is Professor of Politics at New York University. So I ask Aparna Pande to lead us off on this discussion on India at the crossroads of legacy and democracy. Aparna?
Thank you. Good morning, and I'd like to start by thanking Asia Society Policy Institute for inviting me to speak here today. Pleasure to be such distinguished speakers. India is the most populous country in the world. It's the fastest growing economy. It is also on the verge of a massive transformation from a primarily agricultural country to an industrial and technological one. And Indians see their country as a rising global power. The Indian example has often evoked a sense of wonder over the decades. A post-colonial country that was able to sustain democracy, avoid military rule, maintain its diversity, educate and feed its citizens, and protect its territory with little social strife. India's moral stature and image as a democracy are the reason why countries around the world have welcomed India, playing a larger role in the global arena. India's soft image for decades has led to the perception that India would be a benign international power. However, 75 years after independence, there is a struggle between two contending imaginings of India. One, a modern and a secular one, and the second, a conservative and a religious one. And this continues into the 21st century. These contradictions impact not just Indian society, they affect India's economy, its human capital, and even its foreign and security policies. With approximately half of India's population under the age of 26, India has a potential demographic dividend. However, if the workforce is not educated, if a large section of the population, which is the female population, is not part of the workforce, then India is not going to become an economic powerhouse. Why does that matter? An attractive feature of India globally has been its economic potential. However, to achieve that potential, India would need to implement certain sector reforms. A slower economic growth impairs India's rise as a global power. At a time when India seeks to play a bigger role internationally, and its friends around the world are counting on India, the government seems to lack sufficient resources to spend on not just domestically on social and economic issues, but even military and foreign policy. India has a large and formidable military, but it only allocates 1.5 to 1.7% of its GDP towards the military. The bulk of the military budget goes towards salaries and pensions, leaving a very small amount for the purchase of state-of-the-art equipment. So India might have a large military, but it's not a global or a great power military. Now, for most Indians, India's claim to a seat at the global high table comes from its civilization. Its pluralism, its democracy, its soft power, its economic potential, its geostrategic location. There's a reluctance to build and project military power. This is primarily because India views itself as a status quo power that has no revisionist ambitions in its neighborhood or beyond. It seeks to be a nation and a global player, but it lacks territorial or ideological ambitions beyond its neighborhood. It does seek recognition as a regional hegemon, but a more benevolent and status quo-oriented. For India, power projection is for recognition of status. The colonial experience and the colonial legacy left an indelible mark on India's collective personality, including on India's foreign relations. During the Raj, or the British Indian Empire, Indians were kept out of decision-making. And the key demand of India's freedom struggle was the right for Indians to make decisions that affect their lives and their future. As a result, ensuring that any decision India makes is free from external pressures remains at the core of India's foreign policy. While every country seeks autonomy, for India it's a core of its foreign policy. During the Cold War, the principle was non-alignment. After the Cold War, it is referred to as strategic autonomy. Non-alignment helped India keep out of disputes, avoid being drawn into military alliances. It also helped India build relations with developing countries, which today are often referred to as the countries of the global south. In the international arena, India's image has been of a generally responsible global player. The world does not see India as having hegemonic ambitions and does not view India through the prism of its rivalry with China or its conflicts with Pakistan. Global disapproval of nuclear weapons notwithstanding, India has managed to get acceptance for its nuclear status with little difficulty. There is no denying India's promise, but domestic policy affects foreign relations. Developments inside India could affect how India is seen by the world, especially by the United States and Europe. It is sometimes not enough to say that contentious issues are a country's internal matter. India wants to be recognized by others as a great power. A prerequisite for such recognition and for India's global preeminence is that the rest of the world remain comfortable with India's sense of self. Cultural and social legacies need time to change, but India's government need not get involved with addressing real or perceived historical injustices by targeting India's minorities. Its focus instead should be on boosting economic growth, building human capital, and strengthening India's military capabilities. Thank you. I'll hand it back to you.
Ronojoy?
Thank you, Professor Viswanathan, for the introduction, and thanks to the Asia Society for having me here. Since it is the sort of ongoing 75th year of India's independence, one of the things to note is that at the time of independence, India had been written off both as a nation as well as a democracy. However, both have survived, albeit having been labeled as improbable and unlikely. Unlike advanced democracies, voter turnout is extremely high in India, and the membership of political parties has not fallen off. In fact, the Bharatiya Janata Party, or the BJP, claims to be the largest political party in the world currently. However, there are many who would argue that Indian democracy only meets the minimalist definition, where people select government through elections and have a reasonable possibility of removing incumbent governments they do not like, but it fails on several other substantive aspects which we can talk about. Many of the features of competitive authoritarianism, a phrase coined by Levitsky and Way, where regimes employ informal mechanisms of coercion while maintaining the formal architecture of democracy, along with elements of constitutional regression, again a phrase coined by two theorists and law scholars, Ginberg and Huck, are evident today in India. Today, India is very much part of the conversation about democratic breakdown, which Professor Viswanathan mentioned. Indeed, most recognized global surveys, we can quibble with the methodology, have documented a decline in India's democracy, with one calling India an electoral autocracy, which is actually the most common regime type globally. This has evoked a very prickly response from the Indian state, to say the least, even as it has sought to debunk these surveys. In fact, even as we speak, the Indian Parliament is paralyzed because the ruling party is demanding an apology from the opposition leader Rahul Gandhi for comments that he made in Cambridge and in London. So the Parliament is paralyzed on that issue. Last that I heard is that Rahul Gandhi has refused to apologize for what he had said. One of the many factors contributing to the downward shift has been a decline in the quality of critical formal institutions, and that's something that I'll touch on. And among the indicators is the functioning of the legislature. So let me, in the remaining time, say a few words on the state of Parliament, partly because I've just published a book called House of the People on the lower house of Parliament. So since 2014, when the BJP and Prime Minister Modi comes to power, Parliament has been one among a host of institutions that have been marginalized, or one could even say undermined. Scholars who have documented democratic backsliding in India have scrutinized the state of India's institutions, including Parliament. They have noted that unlike Indira Gandhi's emergency, which happened between 1975 to 77, roughly 18 months or so, there has been no frontal attack on democracy and institutions, but the erosion has been incremental, something that has been characterized by one legal scholar as 1,000 cuts on the Indian Constitution. Some of the problems afflicting Parliament are systemic and long-standing, like the low proportion of women and minority representatives. In fact, the current Parliament has the lowest number of Muslims ever in terms of representation in India, which is, I think, roughly, if I remember the numbers correctly, 3.5% of the total number of MPs. The increasingly high bar of wealth to gain entry, again, this is not peculiar to India. Minimal discussion of legislation and policy instruments like the annual budget, which is actually meant to be discussed by the current ongoing session, but as I said, it's paralyzed. The high number of MPs with criminal records and those with a dynastic background, which is something that Professor Chandra has done some excellent work on. Others are of more recent vintage, though they have occasionally surfaced earlier. And I'll just quickly reiterate 4 such issues which have affected critical aspects of Parliament. First, fewer bills or the legislations are being referred to parliamentary committees. The numbers have sharply declined from the parliaments before 2014 and dipped even further since 2019. Indeed, very critical bills such as the abrogation of Article 370, which granted special status to Kashmir, was actually rushed through over the course of a day or 2 days, not referred to a committee. Similarly, a very controversial farm bill was pushed to the Parliament in 2020 without committee scrutiny. Yet another trend has been noticeable. Important bills have been passed as money bills. This is a sort of a constitutional thing in India where money bills do not have to be referred to the upper house or the indirectly elected house, or the Rajya Sabha, where at the time the BJP did not have a majority for at least much of Prime Minister Modi's first term. Under the provisions of the Indian Constitution, a money bill can be introduced in the Lok Sabha and does not need the consent of the upper house. One such bill was a very important Aadhaar, which is the unique identification number for Indian citizens legislation, which has wide-ranging implications, including sort of issues related to surveillance, was introduced and passed as a money bill in 2017. In fact, the legislation was challenged in the Supreme Court, which in 2008 upheld the act. In fact, one of the sort of trends has been the Supreme Court's acquiescence to government policy and state policy, although there has been a bit of pushing back over the last few months under the current Chief Justice D.Y. Chandrachud, who at that time was on the bench. He was not Chief Justice, but in a lone dissent, and dissents are not that common in the Supreme Court, termed the passage of the legislation as a money bill as a subterfuge and a fraud on the Indian Constitution. Third, there has been an increasing recourse since 2014 to ordinances, which gives the President, under a provision of the Constitution, the power to promulgate ordinances when both the houses are not in session. So it's the unilateral decision advised by the government. The Modi government, of course, has not been the first to promulgate ordinances. This issue actually goes back to Jawaharlal Nehru's time. However, between 2014 to 21, so the first term as well as a bit of the second term of Prime Minister Modi, the government promulgated 76 ordinances. The yearly average worked out to roughly 11, compared to 9 for the earlier BJP government under Vajpayee between 1999 and 2004, and only 6 for the Manmohan Singh-led UPA government. Finally, and I'll sort of end here, I think I'm running out of time, the Prime Minister arguably has contributed to the undermining of the place of Parliament in Indian democracy. On May 2014, when Prime Minister first entered Parliament, of course, he was the first-time parliamentarian when he became the Prime Minister. Prime Minister Modi, in fact, much sort of viewed gesture, touched forward on the steps of Parliament, later saying that this is the temple of democracy. However, his reverence for Parliament has not translated into a sustained engagement with the House. The lack of engagement with Parliament on the part of Modi, who, as I said, was a first-time MP, was perhaps not surprising given his legislative record as a Chief Minister of Gujarat. In fact, if we sort of look at the statistics during Modi's final and third term as Chief Minister of the Gujarat Legislative Assembly between 2008 to 12, the Assembly sat for an average of 31 days a year, which is even very low compared to the poor standards of other state assemblies. So it did not have a great legislative record in Gujarat. And in Parliament, Prime Minister Modi has not really made an effort to either debate or deliberate. By one estimate, between 2014 to 20, Modi spoke 22 times in Parliament, which worked out to an average of around 3.6 times a year. This is far lower than, of course, his BJP predecessor, A.B. Vajpayee, who was a very committed parliamentarian and spoke 77 times in his 6 years as Prime Minister, and even less than the quite reticent Manmohan Singh, who actually spoke 48 times during his 10-year tenure. In fact, Prime Minister Modi only uses special occasions, such as the reply to the President's address in Parliament, or debates on important legislation, such as the abrogation of Article 370, to address Parliament and by default directly address the nation. This sort of fits in with Prime Minister Modi's style of communication, which is traditionally practiced and has been described as centralized, one-way messaging, so where Parliament does not really figure much in its sort of political calculations and compulsions. So I end there. Hand it over to you.
Thank you, Ronojoy. And then finally, Kanchan Chandra.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I think we have a great division of labor among the speakers. You heard about foreign policy and political institutions, and I'm going to focus on the economy. And I'm going to say two things and then unpack it. The first point, I want to look at the relationship between India's transforming and fast-growing economy and inequality. But what I want to highlight, I think, more important than the category of inequality is the category of mobility. You could think of that as inequality also, but that sort of it has to do more with inequality in opportunities than just inequality in present-day circumstances. And I'm going to talk about inequality as it applies to caste specifically. And the 2 points I want to make is, one is that India's transforming economy is reinventing caste. And I'll unpack that. That's what I'll talk about for the bulk of my remarks. And the second thing is that this reinvention of caste in the Indian context is one example of how questions of mobility, or you could say inequality, are encased in identity. I think it would be a great, this is not, caste is something which is typically discussed in the Indian context. And there is a broader discussion about inequality across the world, growing inequalities across the world, and growing inequalities in democracies, including the US. And I think while I'm going to focus my remarks on caste, it's very important to look at the way in which these rising inequalities are encased within identity categories. And in India, what you see is caste as a particular form in which inequality is manifesting itself. So on the first point, on what is caste, and again, I know there's a range of people here with different degrees of acquaintance with the idea of caste. I'll start with one of the most, you could say, preeminent theorists of caste, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was also one of the strongest voices for its abolition. Dr. Ambedkar he lived from 1896 to 1956. He was a very active voice in the politics of the nationalist movement in India in the first half of the 20th century and died in 1956. He wrote in an essay in 1917, which is still relevant today, where he spoke about caste as class enclosed by birth. And I think that is a very common conventional view of caste that you often see, certainly in the newspapers. In other words, he argued that it was an occupational category in which there was no mobility because entry was regulated by heredity and there was no exit. That view of caste has been complicated by a large body of scholarship in the humanities and the social sciences that came later. And one particular contribution of this later body of scholarship is to really say that when we think about class, people often think about caste as this fourfold division. You have the priests on top, and then you have warriors, and then you have merchants. And you have a body of scholarship now for decades in the social sciences that says the relevant category when we think of caste, the most important category is not this fourfold division, but hundreds and thousands of micro occupational categories that really sort of where the ground reality of caste is manifested. I think these two views are not that far apart, whether we think of caste as representing four broad categories or thousands of smaller categories. The key thing, and this is what Ambedkar highlighted, is a close relationship between occupation and caste. And I think it would be fair to say that at independence, when India became independent in 1947, occupation and birth were largely tied to each other for a majority of the population. Not entirely, but largely. And then what you had after India became independent, the link between occupation and caste began to be severed. And this is particularly true for Dalits, those castes treated as untouchable by Hindu society to which Dr. Ambedkar belonged. And so the main force which eroded this link in post-colonial India were affirmative action policies. India was then a state-dominated economy, and these affirmative action policies were adopted comprehensively by the Indian Constitution adopted in 1950 in representative institutions, in employment and education. And over time, these policies produced a Dalit middle class, significant upward mobility for a section of Dalits, and an erosion, some erosion of this tie between occupation and birth, particularly for that section of the population. So then the obvious question becomes, well, since 1991, as India moved to a liberalized economy, as the statist economy shifted to an economy dominated by private and global capital, what then happened to this relationship between occupation and caste and between mobility and caste? Following liberalization, as all of the speakers have highlighted, India's economy became one of the fastest growing in the world. There is now some dispute over the precise growth rates after COVID, but also after sort of changes in the statistics for counting. But I think it would be fair to say for much of the typically after at least 2008, but for much of the recent decade, India's economy has been growing at much higher rates than much of the rest of the world, regardless of the dispute about the precise growth rate. This rapid rate of growth, combined with the economic transformations brought about by private and global capital, have been described by one author as India's late industrial revolution. What does this revolution mean for caste? I think the expectation, the commonsensical expectation is that it should increase mobility and erode the link between occupation and heredity of any kind. And this, I think, rests on, so here sort of some reasoning. Caste lives or originated in India's villages. And India, for the most part, so the majority of the Indian population has always lived in rural Indias, and this continues to be the case. But now, with India's new economy, you see greater urbanization. And so now, by the last census, 2011 census, 31% of India's population lives in urban areas. That's still a small figure, but the rate of growth of urban areas has exceeded the rate of growth of rural areas for the first time. India is urbanizing still at slower rates than, say, China, where the most common comparison. So by 2050, for instance, the prediction is that about half of India's population will live in urban areas. And by that point, at least 3/4 of China's population will live in urban areas. So the rate of urbanization is still low compared to India's neighbors, but it's increasing. You also have the majority of India's population still lives in rural areas, but the majority of India's population is no longer dependent on agriculture. So you still have people in rural areas who now who have moved away from cultivation. And in classic terms, when we think about the Industrial Revolution, this is an example of the proletarianization of the countryside as well. And so the classical idea, sort of why we expect, there's this conventional expectation of mobility with any form of industrial revolution is, well, the Industrial Revolution brings urbanization as rural areas turn to manufacturing, for example. And then you also have migration from rural areas to urban areas as agriculture stops paying as an occupation. And so in the end, there's a teleology associated with this view that you end up with that urbanization is everybody's destiny as the economy modernizes, and urbanization is going to produce a mobile workforce. And you have, so now for the first time, according to a UN report, more than 50% of the world's population lives in urban areas. And there too, it's presented as a bit of a teleology that this is the world moving in the direction of urbanization. And what does this mean then for caste in India, and more broadly as we think about democracy, for identity and inequality? And so here is the key point I want to make. I'll take just a couple of minutes more. So you do see rural areas becoming urban in India. You do see rural to urban migration in India. But as rural migrants settle in urban areas, and as rural areas become urban, caste is resettling in urban areas too, in new forms. And so what we see here is not the persistence of caste, but the reinvention. And I think one of the views of caste I want to present to you is it's not a timeless identity that persists. It is an identity that is constantly being reinvented. And I would argue what we are seeing in India today is actually the re-injection of class into caste in new ways. In an odd way, as India modernizes, an identity that we see as highly traditional is in fact being fused into the Indian economy in these new ways. And I'll just say three points. One is, you see, as India's economy transforms, you also see a change in the class structure. And in particular, what you see, I think, is, you read about the Indian middle class and how much it is growing in the new economy. And estimates of the Indian middle class vary very widely. I've seen estimates that go anywhere from 1/4 of the population, which is a high estimate, to 1/20th of the population, which is a very low estimate. But no matter how we count, so it would be more, the middle class, I would say there isn't such a distinction between the middle class and the rich. Essentially, you have a small number of people at the top of the income pyramid in India. And so I think in broad brushstrokes, it's more helpful to think of what is happening in the Indian economy as the creation of an overclass and an underclass. And that especially in urban areas. That underclass includes the vast majority of the Indian population in India's cities and includes the vast majority of the urban population. This underclass is being reshaped by caste in three ways. So let's first, Indian cities now, and this refers to the metropolitan cities, but also the smaller towns where you have the bulk of urban growth in India. You see high levels of residential segregation here. There are a range of studies on this subject, and residential segregation by both caste and religion. But essentially what is happening as India's cities grow and transform is, you could say, a re-establishment of the kind of residential segregation that we see in the classic village, with, say, caste-specific hamlets, reinventing itself in the city, but in new forms. So what you see is also caste is becoming a broader category. The micro-category of caste may be less important. For those of you who know India, let's put this in the terms of that scholarship, the jati was the essential category of segregation in the village. And in the city, the category of segregation may be broader. We sort of think of the broader category of Dalit or ST or Muslim. So the precise form of caste, the size of that category may be changing as India urbanizes, but you see high levels of residential segregation. And here, again, there's sort of a range of scholarship produced, particularly in the last decade, that mentions this. A second is migration. So migration is also caste-specific. When you have permanent migration, which is typically what the census counts, rural to urban migration, where people move for the long term, typically for better-paying jobs, to establish a permanent existence, that kind of migration tends to be the domain mostly of those from upper caste categories, relatively well-off, mostly upper caste. But when you have short-term migration, circular migration, typically sort of this is less well counted. The estimates here range, again, there's sort of no reliable figure on this. The estimates sort of go up to 200 million. Short-term, circular, more precarious migration from rural urban areas is the type of migration in which those from subordinate caste categories are disproportionately represented. The final point is the point on employment. The vast majority of India's workforce is employed in the informal economy. The percentage of those who have a salaried job is very low. And this, this is irrespective of government. This is a long-term trend that reflects the development path that India has chosen. The vast majority of India's workforce works in the informal economy. Economic transformation, many of you would know this, has not brought about very many jobs. Essentially, the salaried jobs have actually shrunk. You have now sort of an expansion of precarious jobs, the informalization of the workforce, including in the organized economy, where there's been a move away from salaries to honoraria or to daily wages. India's pattern of economic growth also has relied less on manufacturing and more on services. And services is not just, what we often see, say, call centers or software or high-tech services. Services also means the development of infrastructure, and particularly construction. So if any of you have visited India recently, the entire country looks like a vast construction zone. The scale of the building is tremendous. New residential developments, airports, factory areas, townships. And so a lot of the rural to urban migrants are now employed in construction. Construction is one of the major employers in the informal economy. And here too, those from subordinate caste categories, in particular scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, are overrepresented. And so significantly overrepresented. Brick kiln workers, for example. These are precarious daily wage jobs where you sort of see. So the classic example of industrial revolutions is you have people moving from rural to urban areas for different, better jobs, and over time a rise in prosperity. But the pattern of migration and employment you see in the Indian case is a move from rural to urban areas for precarious jobs, and rather than rising prosperity, you see people locked into a situation of precarity and blocked mobility. And again, those from subordinate caste groups are disproportionately represented in these categories. So traditionally caste, and Dr. Ambedkar writes about this too, but again, this is a sort of I would say an area-wide agreement. Traditionally caste is maintained, or one of the mechanisms that maintains caste, one is within caste marriage. And again, within caste marriage remains high in India. Again, there are a number of studies on this subject. But in the new economy, there are new mechanisms that you could say sort of keep people locked into these sort of newly defined caste boundaries. And they are access, sort of limited access to high quality education and employment. So here you could say, well, okay, so maybe people from subordinate caste groups are more likely to be counted among precarious migrants. Maybe they're more likely to be represented in the informal economy, but over time they should rise up. And if they had access to high quality education and employment, the kind that you need to make it into the new economy now, well, then you could say, well, then people are not locked in. But essentially what is locking people into these new forms of caste and segregation is insufficient access to high-quality education and employment. There is an expansion in education across India. There is a rise in literacy. But the kind of education that makes you competitive for a salaried job is something that very few people have access to. And so here, let me see. I think that, so now, is there an exit option? Well, one exit option you could think, if the domestic economy is in a way sort of, locking people in when it comes to opportunity, you think, well, international migration, that is often an exit option and has been. And, I think this is an understudied subject, but when we think about the classic case of the Industrial Revolution, say the UK, a lot of the prosperity came not just from rural to urban migration, but from the migration of the English or the Scots to the colonies. So international migration became a great exit option that responded to some of the inequalities of the Industrial Revolution. But in the Indian context, international migration is also enclosed by caste. So you have 18 million Indians who live abroad. The UAE is the largest, not the UAE, sorry, the Gulf is now where the largest. So you have, I think, about 3.2, I don't have the exact figure, but over 3 million Indian migrants in the Gulf, followed by the United States. International migration also tends to be disproportionately upper caste. So here I want to say one more point about caste and mobility. There is mobility. It's not as if India's economic transformation has not produced mobility, but it has produced mobility at the higher end of the caste spectrum as opposed to the subordinate castes. So there has been a great deal of mobility among middle classes. And the middle classes tend to be, and I'll quote here from the sociologist André Bataille, who says the middle classes admit people from all castes, but disproportionately from the upper castes. And so there is one form of mobility. I think there are many Indians who would say the growth story has been fantastic, who are typically at the higher end of the class spectrum. And that is why I think it's helpful to think about a new class structure, which is really sort of an overclass and an underclass. The underclass represents a lock-in effect of both class and caste, and a form of reinvention of caste, new forms of caste that are worth paying attention to. And I'll just conclude by reiterating again that this is an aspect of rising inequality in the world that requires paying attention to in other aspects as well, the way in which new forms of class are encased very much within the categories of identity. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Kanchan. These are three very rich presentations, and I'm sure many of you have questions that you would like to raise, and we're certainly going to leave some time at the end. But I just thought perhaps we could speak more broadly about some of the connecting threads between these three presentations. Something that really struck me, and sort of comes out in your final comments, Kanchan, about international migration, that the kinds of closures that are marked with this transition from rural to urban, and the recreation of these new categories. Excuse me. It's even more complicated when one talks about international migration. And there are two things that I was thinking of. The recent in Seattle. With the is it an edict, or is it how does one describe it? It's to recognize caste as a principle of discrimination, not just race, but caste as a principle of discrimination. And there was tremendous backlash in the Indian press that this is like taking the caste issue well outside of India. And that was actually, and this internationalization of some of these issues is really one of the first issue that I wanted to raise. The second is somewhat different, and this really speaks to the point that Ronojoy was making about the strengthening and the weakening of institutions within India. Universities, for example, let me just talk about universities. There's been, and I think that, was it Aparna, you pointed out that there are fewer resources that are going into institutions, that the weaknesses of some of the institutions is also related to the fact that not enough resources are going into the building of and the fortification of essential institutions. Universities, for example, for in recent years, there's been a lot of attempt to combat what has been perceived as India's kind of low rankings in these world indices, and a lot of money has been poured into raising the level of institutions. So it's not just the IITs that are, part of the rankings, but there are other institutions that can lay claim to a higher rank. But very recently, there's been a proposal inviting foreign universities to set up campuses within India. And I was struck by an article that Kanchan Chandra wrote. Kanchan Chandra is one of the prominent Dalit intellectuals. And he said that this proposal is basically an attempt to kind of reify the existing hierarchies within India, that just at the time when Dalits are coming up through some of the, whether the reservations policy or, affirmative action is just, I think, the better known term here, that just as Dalits are coming up in the educational system of India, this new proposal to have foreign campuses in India that will attract Indian students to these campuses, and that they will be less inclined to attend Indian institutions, and that Dalits may end up being students in these Indian institutions, so that there's this new hierarchy that simply replicates the pre-existing hierarchies. Mm-hmm. So I wondered if any of you would like to speak to these issues of international migration and how this is kind of being reflected in India in terms of, say, the Seattle Edict, and also this issue of foreign campuses in India, and where do universities stand in this role, played by, caste inequality or the global perception of India. And I think, what Aparna pointed out in the beginning, that India wants to be perceived as a global power. But how are these decisions introducing new contradictions within Indian society? So anyone who would like to speak to this or anything else, really?
I want to make a quick point, and then because it's sort of, I think Kanchan and Ronojoy will address these issues much better. I just have two quick points. One, the international migration. India has a very large diaspora. Actually, there are about 8 million Indians in the Gulf. 3 million or so alone just in UAE. And about 2.5 or so in Saudi Arabia. So, sort of, the large, and remittances form a large part of the economy. But the reason that a number of these Indians have gone abroad and are sending money back home, the image of India plays into how they are perceived as well, right? So the way in most of the countries, not in the US or Europe, but for example in the Gulf, they are Indian citizens. And so anything which happens within India will have an impact on how they are perceived, on whether or not they will be able to stay in that region. And so the perception of India, or the changing perception of India, will have an impact on migration, on India's economy. And also, at some level, India hopes that the diaspora in all these countries will help reinforce India's image, India's foreign policy, India's economic potential. But there's a clash always there. If you are an Indian American, at the end of the day, this is your country is the United States. Or if you are an Indian of a British or Indian origin, your country is the United Kingdom. So your perception of India will remain cultural, not necessarily political or foreign policy. With respect to universities, I just have one point. My concern there primarily is if there is an imposition on universities on what can or cannot be taught, the universities may end up being more in the realm of STEM and not humanities and social sciences, which will create another long-term effect, because a country which does not emphasize social sciences, humanities, has a problem in the long run. But
so I'll just say briefly on the question of Seattle, and also on the the diaspora and backlash. I think one of the very interesting things about caste is how invisible it is, particularly I think among the middle classes and often in the diaspora. And so you have caste, especially when it comes to untouchability, there is a great deal of shame around that subject. There is a great deal of, I think many Indians, including in the diaspora, would say that it is a terrible thing, and would also say at the same time, but we don't practice it. And I think that's the issue of invisibility, that caste is very invisible in the middle classes, often in the diaspora, because it's like the air we breathe, it's the water that we swim in. It's not something that is explicitly named or explicitly explicitly challenged. I would say at the higher end of the caste spectrum. And this question comes up often when it is named. For those who are subject to caste discrimination, being able to name it is often a form of liberation. It is a form of resistance. And so this debate came up in India when after decades, in 2011, there was a debate about whether caste should be counted in the census. And there were many people who said, we are just Indians, why would we do something as divisive as counting caste? Whereas people who were subject to discrimination, who benefited from policies aimed at addressing discrimination, said, of course, you should count by caste. If you don't count by caste, how will you design policies to actually ameliorate the effects of caste? And I think it's the same debate playing over with the case of Seattle. What is interesting is in the backlash. So for those of you, there was a resolution by the City Council in Seattle on including caste as a protected category, for protection against discrimination. And I think many Indians, many of those who opposed that, didn't say we support the idea of caste. They said policies like this reactivate or reify something which we don't support in any case. But I think the backlash is often unconscious of the many ways in which the invisibility of caste is itself a form of subjugation.
But there's also, if I recall from the Seattle debate, there's also this backlash that kind of instituting a casteism is racism, basically, is anti-Hindu. That was one of the arguments that was coming out of that, that any attempt to make caste visible is, in a sense, also to diminish Hinduism. So this has been, I think, this is something that I was hearing when Ronojoy talked about the parliament, that the parliament has become this kind of rowdy place now for, squelching the, legitimate issues that are sought to be raised by opposition parties. And yet the sense that to raise these issues is to really downgrade the integrity of the nation. So just this idea that there's this notion of an integrated identity that can be so fractured by even raising questions about it. This to me is, I think, what Ronojoy was describing as the kind of the fragile nature of institutions, even at that moment when there is an attempt to strengthen them through the practice of democracy. I think you made a reference to 1,000 cuts, Ronojoy. Would you like to say more about that?
See, on parliament, actually, disruptions is probably one of the defining features of Indian parliament, unfortunately. So it's not that it's a new occurrence. It's happening over a very specific issue. But for instance, when there were several corruption scandals in the earlier Manmohan Singh government, I remember, I think it was in 2010, an entire session of parliament was held hostage to disruption. There's been a rise in disruption. So that's something to note. The issues differ, but disruptions are fairly constant in parliament. But regarding the 1,000 cuts, I think the reference is to the way it's not a sort of frontal attack, but there's been these sort of incremental changes. So it's not just the parliament, for instance. For the Supreme Court has also been as I was saying, relatively acquiescent to government policies. So, for instance, something like the abrogation of Article 370, which gave special status to Kashmir, that's been challenged in the court, but the case has not come up for hearing. So also for other instances like there's been a fairly controversial citizen charter register that too the court has been sort of procrastinating. So it's not even sort of listed. So I think there are a host of institutions. For instance, the centrally directed the investigating agencies. They've always sort of been blind to the government in power. And one of the arguments is that when the Congress was in power for many years, it used to use the investigative agencies to target opposition members. And that's again happening, without going to the merits of the cases, but you see a plethora of, sort of cases where opposition leaders are being sort of targeted by the central enforcement agencies. So I guess across, I think the point is that across a range of institutions, there has been a certain, undermining happening.
We don't have too much time. We're about, 15 minutes or so, but I'd like to throw the discussion open to the audience. Yes.
Speak up. Two questions. Pakistan, we are undermining Pakistan. Its neighbors are India, of course, Afghanistan, Iran, China. China is being threatened by the West. So there's a growing alliance between Pakistan and China because Pakistan is afraid of a growing India. So what are the prospects of a greater conflict between India and Pakistan involving China? The second thing is economic expenditure and unsustainability. I don't know what it looks like. Maybe it's related to taxation or sovereign debt, if you can say that. The last point is I'm practicing not to, so I'll be here next time. Thank you. This is working.
Are we responding or are we?
Anyone?
Yeah, sure.
Should we take? I'm just wondering whether we should take a couple of questions and then we can have the panel respond.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's a young woman there.
I think
Microphone, and then
Yes.
in the back.
Hi, I'm a student currently studying India's democracy at Hunter College. And I just had a question. So my question is the Kashmiri struggle for liberation and self-determination perceived as a struggle for India's, as a continued threat for India's democracy? And if so, why?
I think this gentleman in the back. Yeah. We'll take these three questions and then. Okay.
Thank you to the panelists for a really interesting, in-depth analysis. I'm curious, a central point that you were making is that, okay, there seems to be agreement India wants to progress economically and be more of a global power, and you laid out different factors that were hampering it in its domestic and global ambitions. However, you mentioned that its inability to pursue military spending on hardware was perhaps should be a priority. I'm curious as to whether there's agreement that that is a main priority, or perhaps access of certain castes to the quality education, which you seem to be indicating would be critical for that mobility, which appeared to be a major hindrance to economic progress. I'm curious as to if there is any agreement between the panelists on prioritization of spending, I suppose. And I'm wondering if the internationalization or the international universities coming to India might potentially present, just because, and I don't know how this works, availability of scholarships for underprivileged castes might actually be a way of ameliorating that sort of caste, that lack of availability in education for certain castes. And that might actually assist in the problem you're identifying, as opposed to having the negative consequence of entrenching discrimination on the education. Sorry, a lot of points, but really interesting. Thank you for your...
Maybe we can just, would you like to? Yeah.
I have a question about marriage. In the end, the fading of caste distinctions and caste practices would have to emerge in intercaste marriage. That would be kind of the final test. Now, my question is, among the Indians in the diaspora, are we seeing any increase in intercaste marriage? One hears a lot about there's little increase, but maybe there's more. And the question is, if there is, what are the chances that this would leak back into the subcontinent and affect marriage there, the way so many westernized traditions and culture have gone back into the subcontinent? What's the prospect for change there? And if there is any, I imagine it would be more in the upper caste diaspora than in the lower caste diaspora, but that's part of the question too. Thank you.
So panel, would you like to take up these various questions?
I'll start off with the China-Pakistan. Actually, Pakistan's relation with China date back to the 1950s. They're very old. Economic and military and nuclear dated to the 1990s. So India is concerned about what some strategists call a two-front war, both China and Pakistan. But at some level, while a terror attack inside India may lead to an escalation of India-Pakistan relations, as of now, there is no indication that China is going to open a second front war. India's problem is going to remain how does it manage its military capabilities, its infrastructure, so as to deal with the rapid changing threat from China, which is technological. It's not just how many men you can have on the border with China. It's AI, it's cyber, it's all of those. So I'd say, India-Pakistan possibility always, but that's been so for 75 years. There's not much of a change on that front, and it's going to remain the same way. Kashmir, I'll just pick on one part of it, and that's for India. Historically, Kashmir has been an issue of territory and identity. It's not necessarily been a question of democracy, though it should be, but it's normally been a question of that Kashmir is a part of Indian territory. And the military economic, yours sounds like a guns versus butter debate, and I'm not entering into that. I believe social issues and economic issues need more. India needs to spend a lot more on its human capital, on its infrastructure, on education, but that does not mean that the world is going to wait for India to do all that. While India has problems on all of its frontiers. So China will not give India 2 decades to build its economy before it decides to do salami slicing on the border. So India should have actually over the last few decades done all the used its economic growth for human capital and for infrastructure, which India has not done. And so while I believe that, domestic is important, you cannot ignore the foreign policy or military dimension. I'll stop there.
I think I'll let you handle the caste and... nothing, very much to add,
I'll try to be quick, and then maybe there'll be a little time left over for more participation on the floor. Maybe I'll just say one thing on education and on Gauri's point about caste in relation to the Hindu majority. On the latter point, caste, I would say, is the central challenge to the Hindu majority in the idea of the nation throughout the century. And so in the nationalist, the period of anti-colonial resistance, Ambedkar actually proposed renaming those who were then called untouchable or depressed classes. He proposed renaming them Protestant Hindus. And he proposed a separate identity. Gandhi and Congress opposed that, In 1990, when you had affirmative action expanded not just to Dalits but to backward castes, that triggered a big Hindu nationalist mobilization. Some of you would remember it as the Rath Yatra. That was initiated immediately after the decision on the Mandal Commission report was announced. What you see now for the BJP, it's very, very important to incorporate caste symbolism, to incorporate caste diversity, and the party has done a fair amount on that. But it's a different model of class mobilization where it wants to respond to caste without naming it and politicizing it explicitly. But I just wanted to point to the absolute importance of caste as a challenge to that kind of mobilization. On the point about universities and education, India made a very old decision starting from the Nehruvian government to invest in institutions of higher education, but not primary education. And so you have very high-quality institutes of higher learning, the IITs, the medical colleges, and now some of that has expanded into the private sector. But for decades, insufficient investment in primary education. And even now, there are two things. There's a lot of variation across states in the quality of education, but I would say the emphasis is much more on literacy, far less on the quality of education. And I think to reiterate what Aparna said, there needs to be investment in human capital, but unless it starts with children at the level of the school, I think by the time you get to the level of the university, the pipeline has already been blocked.
And the recent budget has actually even reduced that commitment to educational resources.
Yeah, and very quickly to add to that question, I think there are a lot of private universities now, being set up in India, and that's also part of the reason why foreign universities are being invited. But the fees are very high. So as you were saying, if there, so it's some people are automatically barred from admissions unless there are sufficient scholarships, and I don't know whether that will happen. I think that will remain always out of the reach of the vast majority of Indians. And quickly on the caste issue, I think one of the successes of the BJP has been, besides Prime Minister Modi's charisma, etc., is how it has actually managed to forge a caste alliance. It was originally, seen as a Brahmin party, a Brahmin and a sort of trader party. But now, a lot of studies have shown that it's actually getting a lot of the, votes from the, the sort of the at the bottom of the caste hierarchy, the so-called scheduled caste, Dalits, a substantial chunk of the so-called, there's so many sort of acronyms, the OBCs or the other backward classes. I think that's also one of the reasons for the BJP's, dominance. It's, in fact, in a way, many people are comparing it to Congress's one-party dominance, back in, for several decades. We are probably in the midst of a one-party dominance of the BJP. Yeah.
We do have a number of questions. We're running out of time, but if you can ask your question quickly, and we can see if we can get a consolidated response. Yeah, yes.
We'll have to wait.
Thank you for such an insightful discussion. My question is, how important of an indicator of the state of democracy is access of media to unscripted interaction with the head of the government? In this case, it's the Prime Minister.
It's a big question. Important. Yes.
Hi, it's just wonderful, your discussion, and I'm thrilled that I'm here. My question is related to the question that Kanchan raised about children and the investment in children. Data that I have been thinking about a lot is that China is going to have 4 women graduates compared to 2 women graduates every month in India. And so we are going to be left far behind. And the issues that you're pointing out about caste, I just wanted to add that as a journalist, I was traveling through India and I saw that there's been immense mobilization of Dalits who vote for BJP. And they are being told by the BJP that if the Muslims are displaced from their land and property and jobs, then it's the Dalits who are going to get it. So this is sort of what's happening. And just to add another comment to what you were talking about, investment in children's education, it's absolutely nothing beyond primary level. And so there's a huge rate of dropout of girls who are going in for early marriage because that's the only way to security because they are unskilled and illiterate. And I fear that in the race with China, while we invest in militarization or equipment or whatever, more sophisticated equipment, what's really going to happen is that India is going to produce a huge underclass who will do the most menial and risky chores in the coming years, and that's going to be the outcome of our demographic dividend. So I would like any of the panelists to talk about that. That, I work on trafficking issues and I see this happening more and more Indians coming, more Indians willing to do the most dangerous and the most menial chores in either the Middle East or in America. So I'd love you to address that, any of the panelists.
I think we're going to have to stop the questions now, but if anyone would like to quickly respond.
Answer my question, sustainability, if you can. Like investment in sustainability. If you know that.
I'm actually going to take a pass on that question. I don't know if the other...
No, I can quickly address the question on unscripted sort of interactions. And, we know for a fact that Prime Minister Modi does not like, giving, having press interactions. And if you, so I was talking about how he prefers sort of this centralized, one-way messaging. And, he's extremely eloquent at that. But when he does have interactions, it's by very friendly interlocutors, usually before the elections, to sort of convey a message. And unfortunately, and I'll end here, if you just come back to the Parliament, Indian Parliament, unlike the British House of Commons, doesn't have a question hour. So it's an institution where you can actually ask the Prime Minister questions that he or she does not know in advance. There's been some talk about that, but that's not there. So even in Parliament, the Prime Minister can't be sort of personally held to account. Maybe some of his ministers can, but there is really no institutional mechanism to do that. So if the Prime Minister prefers not to have, media interactions, there's really nothing, that can be done about that. Yeah, and there are no institutional mechanisms otherwise. The other questions, I don't know. Yeah.
I'm afraid time really is up. So.